There are moments in life that are not loud. No shouting, no dramatic spectacle, just a single question spoken very softly, yet powerful enough to make an entire crowded room fall silent, as if time itself had stopped. That afternoon, inside an aging homeless shelter in Cleveland, Ohio, no one expected anything out of the ordinary to happen. Metal trays clattered together, producing a familiar sound. The smell of hot soup filled the air. Tired people stood in line, each carrying a story they rarely ever told. And then, an older man walked in. He was dressed simply, but there was something unmistakably different about him. Not in an expensive suit, but in his eyes. They were the eyes of someone who had nearly lived an entire lifetime and had only just realized he had missed the most important thing of all. The man's name was Richard Coleman. For 19 years, Richard believed he had been a responsible grandfather, not the kind who showed up for every family dinner, not the kind who drove his granddaughter to school or attended graduation ceremonies, but the kind who never missed a single month, sending money to his granddaughter. Every year, right on schedule. $100,000. Consistently. Not a single dollar missing. Richard believed that by doing so, he was doing the right thing. He believed his granddaughter, Lena, was living safely, comfortably, and well cared for in a quiet suburban neighborhood. He believed that when she came of age, she would go to college like other children, that she would have dreams, a future, a life that her mother, his daughter, never had the chance to finish living. Richard had no idea that throughout all those years, two parallel lives had been unfolding. One life built on bank statements, neat numbers, and blind faith, and another life quietly slipping by in deprivation, isolation, and silence. Lena Coleman, his granddaughter, was now 19 years old. She was not standing in line as a guest. She stood behind an industrial sink in the corner of the kitchen. Her hands were submerged in cold, soapy water, scrubbing metal trays in exchange for her own dinner. She wore an old hoodie, the kind usually tossed into donation bins, long forgotten by whoever once owned it. Jeans that were slightly too short, shoes worn thin at the heels. No one in the room knew that every tray she was washing was being paid for with money that should never have failed to reach her. Richard stood frozen at the entrance. He had donated to places like this before, had signed extensive checks, had believed he understood what it meant to help. But this was the first time he was seeing desperation up close. When the shelter manager asked how she could help him, Richard replied with a single sentence, "I'm looking for my granddaughter." The woman looked surprised. She checked the list, then nodded. "She's working in the kitchen." And that was when Richard saw Lena. No. Introductions were needed. No paperwork, just one look. And he knew. Those eyes, the way she held her back straight despite her exhaustion, the caution without surrender. That was his daughter, living again in another form. Richard took one step forward, then another. The kitchen was still noisy, but something was slowly settling into silence. He stopped a few meters away from her. His voice was not loud. It did not tremble, but it carried a weight that made the people around them instinctively stop what they were doing. Richard asked, not an accusation, not a shout, just a question. "May I ask, the money I have been sending to my granddaughter for the past 19 years, where is it?" No one answered right away. Trays froze mid-motion. The sound of running water suddenly felt louder than ever. A few people turned to look. Lena lifted her head. She looked at the man standing in front of her, a man she had never met, a man she had been taught throughout her childhood, did not want her to exist. And in that moment, it wasn't just the shelter that fell silent. An entire lie, one that had lasted nearly 2 decades, began to crack. Some mistakes are not born out of cruelty. They are created by unhealed pain, and by the belief that as long as one does not look directly at it, everything will be fine. Richard Coleman lived nearly 70 years with that belief. Many years earlier, when he was still a middle-aged man consumed by real estate projects, Richard had grown accustomed to controlling everything through numbers, contracts, revenue, profits. He trusted systems, trusted paperwork, believed that if everything were clearly documented, then things would unfold precisely as planned. But Richard forgot one crucial thing. Human beings do not operate like contracts. The day his daughter, Rachel, died from childbirth complications, Richard's world collapsed in a way no financial report could ever describe. Rachel was his only child, his greatest pride. An emergency room nurse, accustomed to facing life and death for others, yet unable to save her own life. Richard stood outside the delivery room that day. He heard the baby's cry ring out, while his own heart shattered. Lena was born in a moment where joy and loss collided with brutal force. And Richard, a man who had stood firm through deals worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was undone entirely by that emptiness. He could not sleep, could not look into his daughter's room, could not bring himself to hold the newborn baby because every time he looked into that tiny face, he saw Rachel. It was in that void that Melissa Brooks stepped in. She was Rachel's sister-in-law, a woman with a gentle voice and eyes that always seemed understanding. She came to Richard's house, not with demands, but with a proposal that sounded very reasonable. "You're grieving," Melissa said. "You can't work and care for a newborn at the same time. Let me raise Lena. She'll have siblings, a complete family." Richard did not object, not because he didn't love his granddaughter, but because he no longer had the strength to love one more time. He chose the easier path, signing the papers, transferring guardianship, and committing to full financial responsibility. Every year, $100,000, a number large enough to guarantee any child a good life. Richard told himself, "I can't be there every day, but money will do that for me." And he believed it. Melissa said frequent visits would only confuse Lena. The child needed a stable environment. It was best to let her grow up normally without being pulled back into old losses. Richard agreed, not because he didn't care, but because he was afraid to face his own pain. The years passed in a false sense of reassurance. Every month, Richard called to check in, and every time Melissa answered with the same familiar lines. "She's fine. She's a good child. She doesn't like talking much. She's being homeschooled. She doesn't need anything else." And Richard believed again. He didn't ask to see Lena, didn't request video calls, didn't show up unannounced. He let the silence stretch on, because that silence hurt less than the guilt of facing the truth. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Lena was growing up in a very different world. No school, no friends, no real birthdays. No one was asking about her dreams. Melissa called it homeschooling, but in reality, it was isolation. Lena was taught that the outside world was a dangerous place, that she didn't need anyone other than her guardian, that her grandfather was a cold, wealthy man who never wanted her to exist. Those words were repeated so often, they became true in a child's mind. Lena learned not to ask, not to expect, not to hope. And when she turned 19, Melissa said her responsibility was over. No money, no documents, no explanation. Just a door closing behind her, and a world she had never been prepared to enter. As for Richard, he continued to live in the belief that everything was fine, until the day he walked into that shelter. Until the day he saw Lena in the flesh. Until the day he finally understood that money can never replace presence, and that some mistakes are only recognized when the price is to be paid has already become far too great. Some truths do not arrive like thunder. They come slowly, quietly, and by the time you realize them, it is already too late to turn back. After the kitchen of the shelter fell silent from a single question, Richard Coleman stood still, as if his entire body were being held in place by an invisible force. He did not take another step forward, nor did he step back. Before him stood Lena, his granddaughter, with her hands still wet with soap, her eyes caught somewhere between confusion and caution, as if she had grown used to the idea that every good thing came with conditions attached. Richard suddenly understood. If he said the wrong thing now, she might close the only door that had just begun to open. "Could you take a short break?" he asked, his voice so soft that even he wasn't sure it carried far enough. Lena glanced toward the shelter manager. The woman gave a slight nod. Lena wiped her hands on an old towel, stepped away from the sink, and stood facing the stranger she had been taught her entire life did not want her to be. The distance between them was only a few steps, but it was 19 years of silence. Richard studied her face closely, not to look for proof, but to find the truth. He saw his daughter in her eyes, not in resemblance, but in a quiet resilience. The kind of resilience that only appears when someone has grown accustomed to living without protection. "Your name is Lena, isn't it?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes." Richard took a deep breath as if borrowing air just to keep himself upright. "Do you know who I am?" he asked. Lena lifted her head and looked straight at him. No fear, no curiosity. Just a calm emptiness. "No," she replied. "Should I?" The question carried no insult, it simply reflected a cold truth. In Lena's world, Richard had never existed. Richard felt his chest tighten. Not with anger, but with a different kind of pain. The pain of realizing he had been absent for so long that he had become invisible. "My name is Richard," he said slowly. "I am your grandfather." Lena did not step back, but her body stiffened slightly as if one part of her were bracing for impact, while another part was already used to not believing. "That's impossible," she said. "I was told you didn't want to see me." The room seemed to shrink. Richard did not ask who had made that statement. He already knew the answer. "I was told you hated me," Lena continued, her voice even, as though reciting a story she had memorized long ago. "That you thought my mother died because I was born. That you sent money only out of obligation, not because you cared." Each sentence was a cut, not deep, but relentless. Richard felt his legs begin to tremble. He gripped the edge of the stainless steel table behind him to keep from collapsing. The investigator standing with him took a step forward, but Richard motioned for him to stop. This was a moment he had to stand through on his own. "None of that is true," Richard said. This time his voice did not shake. Not once. Not ever. Lena looked at him. Her expression did not change. Because when a child grows up on lies, the truth, no matter how sincere, needs time to be believed. Richard opened the old leather briefcase he had brought with him. He took out a neatly organized stack of papers, bank statements, transfer receipts, rows of consistent numbers stretching back nearly 2 decades. "Every month," he said, "for 19 years, I sent money into a fund in your name. Never missed a single time." Lena looked down at the papers. Her hands trembled slightly, not from emotion, but from confusion. "I've never seen any money," she said. "I don't have an account. I don't have a card. I was never asked what I wanted to study. I didn't even know this money existed." The people around them had stopped working at some point. No one spoke. Everyone understood. They were witnessing a truth being exposed, not about money, but about betrayal. Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment. When he opened them, his gaze had changed. It was no longer a shock. It was resolved. "Then," he said slowly, each word deliberate, "someone has taken not only your money, but also the life you should have had." Lena looked up. For the first time, her eyes were no longer empty. There was something fragile there, not quite hope, but the possibility of hope. "I will not let this continue," Richard said. "Not from today onward." She did not nod. She did not cry. But in that moment, something significant happened. Lena, for the first time in her life, was no longer standing alone. And Richard, after nearly 20 years of running, had chosen not to remain silent any longer. There are moments in life when no more words are needed. You simply have to walk forward. Richard Coleman stood still for a few seconds after his final sentence, not to wait for a reaction, but to ask himself a single question. Do I have the courage to see this through? Because from this moment on, nothing would be the same. No more safe phone calls. No more bank statements emailed and quietly filed away in a drawer. No more room for silence. "Are you ready to leave this place?" Richard asked, his voice slow and steady, as if he didn't want to place any additional weight on Lena's shoulders. Lena looked around the kitchen, at the stacked metal trays, at the sink, so familiar that her hands instinctively knew where the sponge belonged, at the other women, the ones who had shared scarce meals with her, and stories no one ever wanted to tell. This was the place that had sheltered her when she had nowhere else to go. But it was also the place that reminded her every day that her life was temporary. "I don't have much," she said. "Just a backpack." "That's enough," Richard replied. "We'll take care of the rest." There was no applause, no dramatic spectacle, just a decision made very quietly, yet powerful enough to change an entire life. On the way out, Lena walked slowly, not out of hesitation, but because she had grown used to the world changing its mind at any moment. She had learned not to trust promises, especially the ones that sounded too good to be true. The parking lot in front of the shelter was small, the pavement cracked, the wind carried the damp smell of the coming winter. Richard's car was parked there, clean, still, unlike any vehicle Lena had ever known. She stopped in front of the car door. "You don't have to do this," Lena said softly. "I can take care of myself." Richard turned to look at her. There was no pity in his eyes, no urgency, only a rare steadiness. "I know you can," he said, "but you shouldn't have to." Those words made Lena pause for one extra beat, not because she had never heard kindness before, but because no one had ever told her that she deserved help. As the car pulled away from the shelter, Lena sat in the back seat, not because she was told to, but because she wasn't used to sitting in the front and wasn't accustomed to letting someone else take the wheel for her. She looked out the window as familiar places slipped past: the library, where she studied for her GED, the park, where she had spent the night, the streets that had taught her how to walk without being noticed. Richard glanced at her in the rearview mirror. He saw that Lena wasn't crying. She was simply watching, as if memorizing every detail in case she needed to return. He understood that. Trust is not built with words. It is built with time and action. The car moved from old neighborhoods to wider roads, from small grocery stores to taller buildings. Every kilometer passed opened a different layer of the world before Lena's eyes. Not a world of luxury, but a world of possibility. When the car stopped in front of the building where Richard was staying temporarily, Lena didn't step out right away. She looked up at the tall windows, warm light spilling from within. "I'm scared," she said. No hesitation, no shame. Richard nodded. "So am I." That admission, simple but honest, made Lena feel, for the first time, that she wasn't the only one struggling to find her footing. Inside the apartment, everything was neat and tidy. Too neat. Lena walked lightly as if afraid to disturb an order that wasn't meant for her. Richard noticed. He didn't say anything, but inside him, every small gesture felt like an accusation. "You can rest for a bit," he said. "Today has been long." Lena nodded. She set her backpack down, everything she owned, and stood still for a moment, as if waiting for someone to tell her she wasn't allowed to be here. No one did. When Lena stepped into the guest room, Richard remained in the living room. He took out his phone, not to check in, not to reassure himself, but to begin uncovering everything. He called the investigator, then the lawyer, then a financial expert. No small talk, no lengthy explanations. "There is a fund in my granddaughter's name," Richard said, "and I need to know where every single dollar went. Immediately." The call ended. Richard sat down. His hands rested on his knees, clenched tight. In the other room, Lena sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the sound of running water from the bathroom. She looked around, still unsure if this was real. But this time, instead of preparing herself to lose everything, she allowed herself to think of one tiny thing. Maybe, just maybe, things would be different. And Richard, for the first time in nearly 20 years, understood this. Leaving the darkness is only the first step. What's harder is staying in the light and never turning away again. There was one thing Richard Coleman understood very clearly. Money never truly disappears. It only changes hands. And once you begin tracing the trail of numbers, you quickly learn who has been moving in the shadows and who chose to remain there. The next morning, as the first sunlight filtered through the glass windows, Richard was already seated at his desk. He hadn't slept much. Not from exhaustion, but because his mind wouldn't allow it. Every time he closed his eyes, the image of Lena standing beside the industrial sink resurfaced with painful clarity, a reminder that every minute of delay carried a cost. The first call was made before the city even woke up. No pleasantries, no small talk. "We need to track every dollar," Richard said. "Every transfer, every intermediary account. Leave nothing unchecked." The person on the other end understood immediately. People who work with financial data aren't accustomed to emotion, but they are accustomed to truth. Meanwhile, Lena woke up in an unfamiliar room, the scent of clean sheets leaving her slightly disoriented. She sat up slowly, as if afraid everything might vanish if she moved too quickly. On the bedside table lay a small note. "Breakfast whenever you're ready. I'll be in the other room." Just one line, but to Lena, it was a form of care she had never known. In the other part of the apartment, Richard stared at his computer screen. Rows of data filled the display, cold and precise. Every transaction carried a timestamp, an amount, and a receiving account. No assumptions, no emotions. And the truth began to surface. At first, the transfers were small, just enough to avoid drawing attention. Then the amounts gradually increased. consistent, systematic. An account in Lena's name, a single authorized guardian. Everything technically legal until it no longer made sense. A suburban house was purchased a few years earlier, not through a loan, not through savings. Paid in full. New vehicles appearing in insurance records, private school tuition paid on time, luxury trips recorded on credit card statements. They all shared one thing in common, the same source of funds. Richard leaned back in his chair. He didn't close his eyes, didn't sigh. He simply sat there, as if his body were trying to absorb a truth his mind had already accepted. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a plan that had spanned nearly 2 decades. And Lena, when she heard Richard explain what had been uncovered, didn't cry. She fell silent. The trail, to her, was already familiar. But what made her tremble was realizing that a lack of money didn't cause her years of deprivation. Instead, it was that someone had decided she didn't deserve it. "I used to think I needed to try harder," Lena said softly. "If I were better, more obedient, maybe things would have been different." Richard determined to her. This time he couldn't hold back. "No," he said. "There are no ifs here. You lacked nothing. You were taken from." From that moment on, everything moved at a faster pace, not because Richard rushed, but because the truth is no longer allowed to be delayed. The lawyer was called, a case file was opened, legal clauses were reviewed line by line. And then there was one call Richard knew he could no longer avoid. That phone number had been in his contacts for nearly 20 years, used only in case of emergency. This time, everything was an emergency. The call was answered after a few rings. A familiar voice came through, still gentle, just as it had always been, as if nothing wrong had ever happened over the past 20 years. "Richard? What's going on?" He didn't respond immediately, not out of hesitation, but because he wanted to be certain that once he spoke, there would be no turning back. "I've met Lena," Richard said. His voice wasn't loud, but it was cold enough to freeze the air. A silence stretched longer than usual. "She's all right, isn't she?" the voice asked, sounding like a well-practiced reflex. "She's been living in a shelter," Richard replied, "washing food trays in exchange for dinner, wearing donated clothes, no bank account, no documents." This time, the silence could no longer hide anything. "I'm going to ask you one question," Richard continued, "and I need one answer." He paused for a beat. "The money I've been sending my granddaughter for the past 19 years, where is it?" On the other end of the line, the gentle breathing was gone, and in that moment, Richard understood something with absolute clarity. When the numbers have spoken, no lie can remain standing. Some confrontations require no threats. They are powerful enough to make someone tremble. Through truth alone. That morning, the sky over Cleveland was a thin gray. No rain, but no sunlight either. Richard Coleman sat in the car, both hands resting on the steering wheel, the radio off. He needed silence. Not to calm himself, but to hear every one of his own thoughts clearly. Beside him, Lena sat upright, her hands resting on her thighs, fingers tightly interlaced. She wasn't looking outside. She was staring straight ahead. "You don't have to go," Richard said, his voice slow and steady. "I can do this on my own." Lena shook her head, no hesitation. "No," she said. "I need to be there. I need to hear the truth from the person who lived on lies with me." Richard nodded. He understood. There are wounds that only close when we dare to touch them. The car stopped in front of a large suburban house where the lawn was neatly trimmed, the stone pathway spotless, and the expansive windows reflected a life of comfort and abundance. Richard looked at the house, every brick, every window frame, and knew that everything there had been paid for with seasons of Lena's life she would never get back. He pressed the doorbell. The door opened almost immediately, as if the person inside had been waiting. Melissa appeared, her face tightening for a brief second when she saw Richard. But the moment that truly drained the color from her face was when she saw Lena standing beside him. No worn hoodie, no withdrawn posture. Lena stood straight. Her gaze was so calm it was unsettling. "Richard," Melissa said, forcing a smile. "You came without calling." "We need to talk," Richard interrupted. His voice wasn't loud, but it allowed no dismissal. Melissa stepped back half a pace, not out of fear, but because she understood that today her old words would no longer work. They sat in the living room, elegant furnishings, expensive decor. The air was so heavy it felt as though every breath could be heard. Richard placed his briefcase on the table. He didn't open it right away. "Before I say anything," he began, "I want to ask you one question, and I need you to answer honestly." Melissa nodded, her eyes flicking briefly toward Lena before turning away. "For 19 years, Richard said slowly, I sent money to my granddaughter, consistently, without fail, without delay. You were the only person authorized to manage that money." He paused, not to catch his breath, but to let the silence do its work. "So," he continued, "where is that money?" Melissa pressed her lips together. In that brief moment, every mask slipped away. No more feigned concern, no more gentle tone, only the tension of someone backed into a corner. "I used it for Lena," she said. "I raised her. Do you think that costs nothing?" Lena tilted her head slightly. Her voice was strangely calm. "You fed me leftovers," she said. "You made me wear second-hand clothes. You didn't let me go to school. You didn't let me have friends. And when I turned 19, you told me to leave." Melissa snapped toward her, anger flashing in her eyes. "You should be grateful," she snapped. "Without me, you'd have had nothing." Richard stood up, not quickly, not forcefully, yet the entire room seemed to shift. "No," he said. "Without you, my granddaughter would have had everything." He opened the briefcase, took out neatly marked stacks of papers, bank statements, property purchase contracts, tuition invoices. Cold numbers lay orderly on the table, without emotion, without judgment, carrying only truth. "This house," Richard said, gesturing around the room, "was bought with Lena's money. The trips, the cars, your children's schools. All of it." Melissa let out a short laugh, dry, brittle. "You don't understand," she said. "That girl had everything from birth. A mother who was loved, a wealthy grandfather. And what about my children? What did they have?" Richard looked straight at her. "You used your own unhappiness as justification to destroy an innocent child," he said. "That's not trauma. That's a choice." Lena stood up. This time her voice trembled slightly, but it wasn't weak. "You didn't just take my money," she said. "You took my trust, my childhood. And you made me believe that I wasn't worthy of being loved." The room fell silent. There were no excuses left strong enough, no stories or clever enough. Only the naked truth standing in the middle of that luxurious room like a verdict already delivered. Richard looked down at Lena. Then he turned back to Melissa. "From this moment on," he said, "this is no longer between you and me. The law will handle the rest. And as they turned and walked away, Richard knew this. The mask had fallen. The truth had stepped into the light. And no one could turn back now without paying the price. There are some doors that, once closed, will never open again. The door of the suburban house closed softly behind Richard and Lena. No slam, no farewell. Yet in that moment, a chapter nearly 20 years long, written entirely in lies, officially came to an end. Richard walked slowly down the front steps, not because of age, but because he was carrying a different kind of weight, the responsibility of truth. Lena walked beside him, her posture straight, her gaze no longer evasive. She did not look back at the house, not out of bitterness, but because she knew there were places not worth carrying with you in memory. The car pulled away. No one spoke during the first stretch of the drive. This silence was no longer heavy. It felt like a deep breath taken before a prolonged rain, necessary, unavoidable. That very afternoon, legal proceedings were initiated, not through emotion, not through outrage, but through documents that had been carefully prepared days earlier. Bank statements, purchase contracts, tuition records, financial trails that could not be denied, all laid out neatly on the lawyer's desk. To the law, truth does not need to shout. It only needs sufficient evidence. Lena did not attend every meeting. Richard did not want her burdened with those dry, sharp details, but she knew. She knew each step that was unfolding, and every evening as they sat across from one another in the quiet kitchen, Richard told her what she needed to know. No more, no less. "You don't have to listen if you're not ready," he once said. Lena shook her head. "I need to know," she replied. "I've lived in the dark for too long." A few days later, a summons was issued. There was no dramatic arrest, no sirens, no television cameras. Just a morning when everything left no room for retreat. Melissa was required to appear and explain herself. Her familiar justifications quickly collapsed under the weight of cold numbers. She spoke of living expenses, of caretaking responsibilities, of silent sacrifices. But this time, no one listened with sympathy, because the truth had been placed on the table, and it required no interpretation. When the decision to detain temporarily was made, Lena was not present. Richard had asked whether she wanted to come. She had thought for a long time. Then she shook her head. "I don't need to see her in handcuffs to know I'm free," Lena said. "I just need to know it's over." The trial progressed more quickly than many had expected, not because the system rushed, but because the evidence left no room for delay. Every transfer, every signature, every record, all of it stacked together into a story so clear it was brutal. Melissa was found guilty. Not a mistake, but it was a deliberate series of choices spanning nearly 2 decades. The sentence was delivered in a modest courtroom. There were no cheers, no sense of triumph. Only closure, like finishing a book you stayed up all night reading, knowing it hurt but needed to be finished. Assets were frozen, the house, the cars, the accounts that had once been hidden. The recovered funds were transferred into a new trust, this time in Lena's name and under strict oversight. Richard did not consider it a victory. He considered it a responsibility restored. As for Lena, when she heard the final news, she sat quietly for a long time. No tears, no smile. She looked out the window where the afternoon sunlight touched the glass, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel as though she were waiting for something to be taken away. "I feel lighter," she said after a while. "Not because she was punished, but because I'm no longer bound to her story." Richard looked at her. He knew that justice could not restore a lost childhood. It could not erase nights Lena slept in parks or meals earned through labor. But justice could do one essential thing. It could return the right to begin again. That evening, Richard placed a cup of tea in front of Lena. She wrapped her hands around it, the warmth spreading into her palms. A tiny gesture, but one she had been missing for many years. Care without conditions. "This isn't over yet," Richard said softly. "But the hardest part is behind us." Lena nodded. "I know," she replied. "And this time, I'm not walking alone." Somewhere outside, the city went on as usual. People went to work, came home, ate dinner, and went to sleep. But for Lena, the world had shifted just slightly, enough for her to stand a little straighter, breathe a little deeper, and look ahead. Because sometimes, justice is not loud. It simply arrives and puts everything back where it belongs. Life doesn't change overnight. It doesn't operate the way fairy tales do. There is no moment when everything suddenly becomes perfect. But there are mornings when you wake up and realize, at the very least, today you don't have to worry about being forced out of the place where you're standing. That was the first morning Lena woke up without fear. Not the fear of hunger, not the fear of losing shelter, but the familiar feeling she had carried for 19 years. The fear that anything good was only temporary. Sunlight filtered through the window, falling onto the floor in gentle streaks. Lena sat up very slowly, as if moving too quickly might cause reality to shatter like a fragile dream. She took a deep breath. The air was quiet. No shouting, no hurried footsteps. No one is demanding that she earn the right to stay. Just silence, and a sense of safety appearing for the first time. In the kitchen, Richard was making coffee. He didn't ask whether Lena had slept well. He didn't ask if she was getting used to the new place. He understood that those questions, however kind, sometimes only reminded people that they once had nothing they could ever call familiar. Instead, he set an extra cup on the table. Lena sat down on her own. A minimal action, but to her, it was a quiet declaration. "I'm allowed to be here." The days that followed passed slowly. No one pressured Lena to make up for the years she had lost. No one demanded that she become a better, more perfect version of herself quickly. Richard rearranged his work schedule. He made time, the very thing he had once believed money could replace. They started with very ordinary things, walking around the neighborhood, buying personal necessities, sitting in the library while Lena re-enrolled in classes. Lena wasn't used to being asked for her opinion. What do you want to study? What do you enjoy? Where do you want to begin? Those questions confused her more than years of deprivation ever had. Because for the first time, the choice was hers, not as a test, but as a right. She chose to continue her education, not to prove anything, but because she had once dreamed in silence. Lena began applying to college preparatory programs. The counseling sessions made her realize how much foundational knowledge she was missing, not because she was incapable, but because she had never been allowed to acquire it. And this time, instead of feeling ashamed, she allowed herself to start over. Richard didn't correct her mistakes in front of others. He didn't showcase her achievements as a way to make amends. He simply stayed present. In the evenings, while Lena read materials in the living room, Richard sat at his desk, the television off. He didn't fill the space with noise. They existed together in the same room, without needing many words, and that was enough to heal. One afternoon, Lena stood in front of the mirror for a long time. She looked at her reflection, not to search for flaws, but to become acquainted with herself. A person who no longer had to shrink inward, no longer had to anticipate others' moods to survive. "Why don't you ask me what I need to do to deserve all of this?" Lena asked, her voice gentle but serious. Richard looked at her. "Because you don't need to deserve it," he replied. "You always have." That sentence didn't make Lena cry right away. It needed time to sink in, like water soaking into dry soil. Gradually, Lena began to sleep more deeply, to eat more regularly, and she no longer startled at unfamiliar sounds. She began drawing again, a habit that had once been dismissed as a waste of time. At first, her lines were unsteady, but day by day they grew more confident. In those drawings, Richard saw things Lena had never said aloud: loneliness, endurance, and a quiet vitality that refused to be broken. One evening, Lena set her sketchbook down and turned to Richard. "I don't know what the future will look like," she said. "But for the first time, I'm not afraid of it." Richard smiled. Not the smile of someone who had fixed everything, but the smile of someone who understood that the most valuable thing isn't the outcome. It's the ability to keep moving forward. Because sometimes healing doesn't come from having what was lost returned. It comes from being given a place that is safe enough to begin again. And for Lena, that new life finally had somewhere it could stay. One morning, Lena woke up with an extraordinary thought. Not, "What do I need to do today so I won't be abandoned?" Not, "If I make a mistake, will everything disappear?" But an entirely different question. If I survived, what will I do with that? That question didn't come from books. It came from the evenings Lena spent sitting by the window, watching the city lights come on, remembering the faces at the shelter, the women who had shared scarce meals with her, stories no one wanted to tell, and dreams that never had the chance to be named. Lena realized something very clearly. She was not the only one who had been forgotten. And if she turned away, lived a normal life as if nothing had ever happened, then her story would end with being rescued. But Lena didn't want only to be rescued. She wanted to become the reason someone else could believe that they too could be saved. That thought led her back to a place many people would never want to return: the old shelter. This time, Lena didn't walk in with a single backpack on her shoulders. She walked in with a volunteer badge, and with a calmness she herself was surprised to discover she now possessed. The people there recognized her immediately, not because of her clothes, but because of her eyes. The eyes of someone who had once stood where they stood, and understood. Lena didn't tell her story right away. She started with tiny things, helping fill out forms, showing how to register for classes, sitting and listening, truly listening when someone said they were tired and afraid. Some evenings, Lena sat beside young girls who had just aged out of the foster system, unsure where they would sleep the next day. She didn't offer grand advice. She simply said, "You are not invisible. You are not struggling because you are incapable. You are surviving, and that is enough to begin." Those words were not slogans. They were truths drawn from years Lena once believed she would never make it through. Richard saw the change in his granddaughter. Not a loud change, but a quiet steadiness. She no longer shrank back when new decisions arose. She no longer asked for permission to exist. One evening, Lena came home carrying a stack of papers. Not homework, not applications. A draft. "I want to start a small fund," she said. "Nothing big, just enough to help people like me have one more chance." Richard didn't ask if she was sure. He didn't ask how much it would cost. He asked only one thing. "What do you want it to help with the most?" Lena thought for a long time. "To help them not be afraid of their birthdays," she said. "To help them not be pushed into the world just because of a number on a document." And that was how the Second Chance Fund was born. No noise, no fanfare, focused on just one thing: giving young people leaving the care system a first foothold, rent money, books, tuition, and someone to call when everything falls apart. On the day the first grants were awarded, Lena stood before 3 young women. They held simple envelopes in their hands, their eyes filled with both hope and fear. Lena looked at them and saw herself from a year earlier. "None of you have to prove that you deserve this," Lena said. "You were worthy from the beginning." Richard stood quietly in the back. He wasn't proud in a loud way, he simply felt grateful. Grateful that his granddaughter didn't let pain turn her bitter. Grateful that she chose to open doors instead of building more walls. One late afternoon, after returning from the shelter, Lena sat down beside Richard. "I used to think surviving was the destination," she said. "But it turns out it was only the beginning." Richard nodded. "And you chose to begin in the hardest way," he said, "but also the right one." Lena smiled, a smile no longer cautious, no longer afraid of being taken away. The smile of someone who had walked through the darkness and carried light back with her. Because there are people who don't just walk out of the past, they return to guide those still trapped inside. And sometimes, the most significant meaning of survival is being able to say to the world, "If I can stand up from here, then you can too." Some stories don't end with a resounding victory. No fireworks, no declaration that everything will be perfect from now on. Lena's story is like that. Everything that followed unfolded very slowly, so slowly that if you weren't paying attention, you might think nothing had changed. But it was precisely in that slowness that the most important thing happened. Lena began living a life that no longer required constant defense. No more habit of predicting other people's moods. No more fear every time the phone rang or a door opened. No more feeling that kindness had to be paid for. She learned to believe that good things don't always come with conditions. Richard changed too, in ways even he hadn't expected. For most of his life, he had been used to building things that could be seen: tall buildings, major contracts, numbers that earned others admiration. But now, every morning, he learned to build something else: presence. He learned to ask Lena simple questions, not to control, but to understand. He learned to be silent when needed, not to avoid, but to listen more effectively. And he learned to forgive himself, not to forget his mistakes, but to make sure he didn't repeat them. One afternoon, grandfather and granddaughter sat together in a park. No schedule, no plans. Lena held a small notebook jotting down ideas for the support fund she was expanding. Richard looked at her and suddenly realized the little girl he had once been unable to bring himself to hold had grown into a woman who knew what she wanted and was ready to take responsibility for it. "Do you regret it?" Lena asked suddenly. Richard didn't answer right away. He watched leaves fall along the path, thinking about the years that had been lost, nights he wasn't there, birthdays he never knew about, moments he should have shown up for. "Yes," he said honestly, "but I don't want that regret to define the rest of my life." Lena nodded. "Me neither." That was where they understood each other. Lena's story is not a story about money being returned. It is a story about the right to exist without asking permission. Richard's story is not about a hero arriving just in time. It is the story of a man willing to face his own failure and choose to do the right thing, even if it's late. On a very ordinary day, no anniversary, no milestone, Lena returned to the old shelter. This time she didn't come as someone who had been rescued, but as someone willing to stay. She sat beside a young woman who had recently left the care system, trembling because she didn't know where she would go the next day. Lena didn't say much. She simply placed a hand on the girl's shoulder and said, "You're not late. You're just beginning." Some sentences don't change the whole world, but they change the way one person sees themselves. And sometimes that is enough. That evening, Lena returned home. Richard was in the living room, midway through a book. He looked up when he heard the door. "How was your day?" he asked. Lena smiled. "Tiring," she said, "but the kind of tired that's worth it." Richard nodded. He understood, because there is a kind of exhaustion born from trying to survive, and there is a kind of exhaustion born from living with purpose. Before going to bed, Lena opened her laptop and finished an essay for class. The topic was an experience that changed your life. She wrote without rushing, without forcing it. The words came naturally, as if, at last, her story had found a place to stay. She ended the essay with a single line. The most important thing isn't what was taken away. It's who stayed, and who you became after everything. Lena closed the laptop. Outside, the city lights were still on. Somewhere, some likely people still believed they had been forgotten, that no one heard them, that they weren't significant enough to be protected. But if this story could reach someone like that, just one person, then it has fulfilled its purpose. Because the value of a life is not measured by how many times you were abandoned, but by how you stand back up, connect, and choose to become a light for others. If this story made you pause for even a moment, please share it with someone who needs to be reminded that they are not invisible. Like if you believe kindness still has a place. Comment and tell us, what difficult moment did you stand back up from in your life? And subscribe to Deep Life Tales, where real-life stories are told with empathy, to remind us that you are not defined by who walked away from you, but by how you choose to live after that. See you in the following story.